So thank you very much for being here. I'm very happy to welcome Ludo Schoenmakers to this. It's the okay, sort of pronunciation. He's a postdoctoral fellow at the KLI, Konrad Lorenz Institute for Evolution and Cognition Research. He had a PhD in synthetic biology, then decided he wanted the real money and is moving to philosophy and looking for that. So one day he will tell us if he succeeded in his enterprise. So he's working. He's working a lot on topics related to origins of life. So he published a paper on definitions of life and one on prebiotic selection, prebiotic evolution, and now today he's talking about another issue in origins of life, that is the role of continuity in shaping and legitimizing origins of life research. So thank you very much, Ludo, for coming here. You're welcome.
Thank you very much. Ludo, Schoenmakers is a Dutch pronunciation. No one ever does that. So Schoenmakers is the way my Canadian family says it, so that's perfectly fine. I'm going to talk today about a sort of history and philosophy of science type topic, where we're going to look at the role that the principle of continuity played in origins of life research in the 20th century. Now, this is not work that I've been doing alone. It's work that I've been doing together with Jules McComb, who has visited me at the KLI for a few weeks, just a few weeks ago. So think about Jules as well throughout this. Right, so my current interests are, well, part of it is sort of origins of life research, so the philosophy of origins of life research, and synthetic biology. I've worked on questions like what is life, and should we even care about that question? Also the question of evolution at the origins of life, and I'm also sort of interested in the history and philosophy of the general origins of life field, and that's what I'll be talking about today. Something I also like, in case you're interested in this as well and want to talk about it, is the notion of scientific understanding, and particularly the role that this plays in the life and natural sciences. So I'm interested in biology generally, but also evolutionary biology specifically, as well as working together with a friend of mine who's a theoretical physicist on looking at this notion in theoretical computer science. Right, so I'm at the Konrad Lorenz Institute for Evolution and Cognition Research. Just a little bit of sort of advertisement. It's an institute in Klosterneuburg near Vienna. It's named after the guy on the right, who was an ethologist, someone studying animal behavior. He won the Nobel Prize in 1973 with the guy on the left, who's Nicolaas Tinbergen, a Dutchman. And they worked on animal behavior and instinct, became a very, very famous figure in Austria. And there's a few institutes in the country that are named after Konrad Lorenz. The KLI is one. And it's an interdisciplinary research institute where we look at all sorts of questions related to evolutionary theory. So really inside evolutionary theory itself, but also sociology, history, philosophy. It's a really diverse group. We have fellowships. So I'm a postdoctoral fellow. You can apply to those fellowships, both as a postdoc, but also as a writing up fellow if you are at the end of your PhD and it has something to do with evolution. There's visiting fellowships as well for a few weeks, so I would highly recommend looking at it, visiting. Today, I'll do a little bit of an introduction to sort of origins of life research, and then we'll get into the actual topic, which is this notion of continuity. The continuity basically between life and non-life. We'll look at sort of the relationship of continuity to vitalism, which was a particular way of looking at life that was popular between the 17th and the 20th century, but there's a particular period in the 20th century that I'm interested in here. And then we'll look at something that sort of myself and Jules have invented, mostly Jules to be honest, which is miraculism, this sort of other way of looking at life that we think occurs from the second half of the 20th century onwards. And then we'll sort of wrap up. So origins of life research. What do? People in origins of life research look at how life originated and when life originated. It's a very interdisciplinary field, so you have chemists, biologists, physicists, computer scientists, and they use all sorts of different methods to sort of try and understand how life came about. presumably on this planet. So how did we get from a lifeless world 4.5 billion years ago to one which is filled with as much life as we see today, right? Especially here, by the way, I was shocked by how green the Basque country is. There's lots of life here, right? There used to be none. How did this come about? And there's sort of major phases in this field. There is sort of a pre-Darwinian period before the 1850s. Anyone who knows anything about sort of the history of science and modern science, medieval science, ancient science, I'm lumping all of that together. Don't hate me for that. There's lots of different and interesting distinctions that you can make there. It's just not something that I'm talking about today. What makes it reasonable to call it the Darwinian period is because we really got a really different perspective on life and biology after the publication of The Origins of Species and sort of subsequent research. So I think that's quite a different period. Okay, so with Darwin, sort of you get this sort of Darwinian period, or what you can call speculative period, where people are starting to speculate about the origins of life, but in a less sort of metaphysical and vague way that they used to do before Darwin. As sort of knowledge of all kinds of chemical and cell biological processes increases, you enter into sort of a theoretical period, I would say from roughly the beginning of the 20th century until the 1950s. You can also call it the Opera and Haldane period. I'll come back to that. And here what you see is that Darwin-inspired speculation of the latter half of the 19th century turns into something even more concrete, but still quite speculative, hence theoretical. And then finally, from the 1950s onwards, you get actual experiments into the origin of life. And that's why I think we should call that the experimental period. And we're still in that period, I would say. Okay, so the Darwinian speculative period, what was the influence of Darwin there? Really, he put the origin of life to a point, and that really hadn't happened yet. One of the big ideas in the origins is the theory of common descent. So the idea that all life, all the species that we see, the great variety of species that we see, can ultimately be brought back to a single origin point or a few species perhaps, right? But at least it's not that great diversity that we see now. It goes back to a point. This is the only diagram or image or scheme in the entire Origins of Species, right? The rest is pure text. So he really sort of thought it very, very important to sort of show that what might be sort of this difference in all these species that we see now, if you go backwards, right, they all come from a similar origin. And this is sort of the famous drawing of this tree idea of life with a sort of I think above it, still in 1937. So this is a good 20 years before The Origin is published. Okay, so within that Darwinian period, you get sort of people who then say, okay, apparently we need to sort of go back from the life that we see now to something which is sort of a very, very simple kind of life. It stands to reason that these are single-celled organisms, right? Something like a bacterium. So people start thinking about, okay, what would we sort of need to be able to understand how bacteria come about? And there's a wider discussion here about spontaneous generation and Pasteur, and all of this is going on as well. We don't have time to get into that. But that's sort of the frame of mind in which people are operating. But at the same time, they don't know a lot about the cell on a very concrete level. They know some structures, they have microscopes, they can see like a centrosome or the centromere, right? They can see sort of division, people in embryology looking at these processes, all very, very interesting, but there's no real notion of the molecular buildup of these systems, right? They start calling the inside of the cell the protoplasm. They can decompose it into carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, hydrogen, a little bit of phosphor, a few other things. That all starts to make sense, but it's just a decomposition. They just know that these are the elements that are involved in the protoplasm, but they have no real understanding of sort of the molecules that are involved there. That begins to change in the sort of early 20th century period, simply because this chemical knowledge is slowly sort of coming in, right? Organic chemists are more and more aware of the molecular buildup of these cells, and this leads to sort of speculative theories of the origins of life, but they're a little bit more concrete. That's why I call them theoretical. And particularly interesting and sort of important figures here are Alexander Oparin and GBS Haldane, who write papers/books around a similar period in which they sort of give a more extensive theory of life and its origins in terms of chemistry. And basically what they argue for, this sort of Operin-Haldane hypothesis, is that life is a result of a slow buildup of organic chemical complexity, starting from simple inorganic molecules like oxygen and methane, hydrogen gas, and an external energy source. And then what really is important about these works is that they sort of fuel the idea that you can really investigate the origin of life scientifically, and that you should do it scientifically. What should I do? Oh, right, there's an actual, what I'm now standing in the way of. So I should stay here. Okay. Yeah, good. I'll stay here then. I'm very sorry. Right, so still not a lot of experimentation. That starts to change only in the 1950s with a very, very famous experiment called the Miller-Urey experiment, where basically what they did is they take that Operin-Haldane hypothesis, this idea of sort of an early Earth system which had some gases like ammonia, methane, hydrogen, water, liquid water, water vapor, maybe some energy sources, thermal energy, something like an electrical discharge system. If you put that together, what type of molecules might fall out of that? And so they set up the experiment pretty much like they do there on the right. They're missing the hydrogen from the gas in that, by the way. That's also added. It doesn't just come about there in the spark chamber. And then they let that run for a number of days, and they take samples and they see if they can find larger molecules. And indeed they do. So this is the original figure from the 1953 publication. And what they find, most interestingly, are glycine and alanine, and those are two amino acids. And amino acids build up proteins, and proteins build up sort of larger, proteins are particularly important in, well, any form of life because they catalyze chemical reactions. Glycine, by the way, is the molecule you can see there on the left. It's very, very simple. That's another very important amino acid on the right. Tryptophan doesn't come out of this experiment at all, right? So it's not that because you can make some organic molecules this way, you can make all of them. It can be a lot more complicated to create sort of these ring-type structures that you see there on the right in the case of tryptophan. So what do contemporary origin of life researchers do? Like I said, it's very interdisciplinary, so it has biologists, chemists, geologists, computer scientists, physicists, who also then work on yet other more specific topics. Some chemists are prebiotic chemists. They really try to see how can we make these things like a tryptophan from these very, very basic starting materials. Physical chemistry is important. Okay, you can read the rest. And then these are the types of questions that people work on, right? What are protein precursors? What are DNA, RNA precursors? What are the starting materials that we actually had available on early Earth, right? Geochemists might study this. What was the atmosphere like of early Earth? Did we have a solid crust? When did we have liquid water? Because chemistry in liquid water is very, very different from chemistry not in liquid water. There was a moon forming impact at some point. The moon didn't just, hang around the Earth at its formation. There was, this is currently the theory that has most support, there was a collision between proto-Earth and another small planetoid, and that collision actually created the Earth-Moon system. Now you can imagine that if you have anything resembling life before that impact, after that impact, that's probably going to be sterilized because there's a tremendous amount of kinetic energy involved in this, so the surface of your planet just melts again. And melting temperatures are not good for organic molecules. Now, right, many other questions that go into sort of this thinking about the origin of life. And so the day of an origin of life researcher, you might be a prebiotic chemist. In the morning you read some papers, you look at sort of, how did organic molecules perhaps come to Earth, right? Partly they might have formed here, but we now know that organic molecules can also be formed in space. Maybe they were delivered with inorganic dust particles or meteorites. You read about it, and you actually read that in some of these meteorites and some of this material, you can actually detect some organic molecules, right? Or maybe glyceraldehyde. And then you go back to your chemistry where even though glyceraldehyde is something you can, glycoaldehyde is something you can detect in meteorites, you can also try and synthesize it from simpler precursors, right? That's a sort of work that you would be engaged in. Now, there's also lots of that's philosophically interesting. I have the sense that if I go on like this, it will be here for an hour. So I'll try to sort of sneak in a little bit of speed at any one point. Philosophy of origins of life research, we look at many different questions, like how do we define life? What's a good explanation in origins of life research? There's overlap between people who look at astrobiology. What are good biosignatures, right? How would you know that there might have been life on another planet, right? Think of Mars or maybe further away. When did evolution start to apply to early life? This is a topic in which I'm particularly interested. Models, etc., etc. Not a lot of people work in it yet. I think there's lots of interesting stuff that can be studied here from a philosophical perspective, and that's what I try to do. Okay, so the actual topic of today, the continuity of life and non-life. The principle of continuity. So at some point, you get mechanistic theories of the origin of life which sort of become increasingly popular. So these are theories where you say life is some kind of physical chemical system. And if we know enough about physics and chemistry, then we'll know how life works. Okay. And within this viewpoint, life and non-life are continuous, right? So life somehow comes from non-life. We had a planet without life on it, but with lots of molecules, all sorts of energy. And then at some point, you get an arrangement of these molecules, a combination of things that leads to the kinds of living things that we ultimately see today, like you and I, and plants and bacteria and cats and dogs and whatever. Now, Huxley, Thomas Henry Huxley, a famous sort of paleontologist and defender of Darwinian evolution, coins the term abiogenesis for this process, right? So where life comes from non-life. And he basically thinks that, argues that the matter of life is composed of certain compounds, carbon dioxide, water, nitrogen-containing species, that when brought together under certain conditions, give rise to still more complex body, protoplasm, and this protoplasm exhibits the phenomena of life. And crucially for Huxley, there was no break in the series of steps in molecular complication, and he did not understand why language which is applicable to any one of the series may not be used to any of the others. So any language that you might be able to use for physics and chemistry, you can use it as well for any of the steps going from the physics and chemistry to biology ultimately. Darwin also talks about this a little bit in some of his letters, calling it the law of continuity, although he doesn't go into a lot of detail, so it's unclear to what extent he sort of thinks about it in the same way as Huxley does. So in the late 19th century, you get a series of really speculative theories about the origins of life, but they don't lead to experimental programs. They're really just too vague, right? There's too little chemical knowledge, basically, physical knowledge to sort of even know what you would need to try to create. I mean, in a way, it's clear, right? You would want to be able to show how you can get to bacteria or to multicellular organisms like plants. But if you don't have a molecular understanding of these things, then there's no way how you could get from the nitrous compounds, the carbon, the whatever, to those eventual living creatures. Now, by the early 20th century, this situation changes a lot. You have a lot of advances in understanding of cell structure, organic synthesis, analytic chemistry, so identifying which molecules are actually part of whatever you're studying. You get physical chemistry of colloids and lipids, protein chemistry. People start to understand what proteins do, that they're catalysts, that they consist of amino acids. And so you get these theories by Operin and Haldane that I talked about just before, right? These sort of first chemical theories of the origins of life. There's other examples, except for Operin and Haldane, though they are always named, and the big figures in that, the mythical figures of that sort of stage of research. But it should be known that there's other people who were having, who were sort of publishing very similar ideas. Two of these people are Leonard Trolland, a biochemist and psychologist from the United States, who had sort of a chemical account of the origin of life based on autocatalytic proteins, already in 1914. There's Charles B. Lippmann, a microbiologist. Again, life is a molecular system of inorganic molecules that, together with an energy source, thermal electrical, slowly increased in complexity, right? This is just as much the Miller-Urey experiment as anything that Haldane or Operin ever said. One big difference, I think, between these slightly earlier figures and Operin and Haldane, though, is that they don't tend to talk about early Earth conditions that much. And what was actually chemically the case on the planet 4.5 billion years ago when the Earth formed would become a very important topic in origins of life research from the 50s onwards. Okay, so continuity. I talked a little bit about continuity so far. You know, this idea that life and non-life are continuous. But you can unpack that notion in different ways, right? You can say, well, they consist of the same matter, right? So the same kind of stuff that actually makes the living world also goes into the non-living world, right? The same carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, etc. You can also say, well, they're the same kind of thing, right? So both life and non-life are physical things. This sort of entailed if you already believe that life is just a matter of sort of certain molecules being combined in the right sort of way, right? If you think they're materially continuous, you're likely to think that they're also sort of physically or ontologically continuous. They're governed by the same laws. So whatever laws, natural laws we find, if you go for that sort of way of looking at sort of reality, they govern physical, chemical reality, non-living reality just as much as living reality. And finally, you might even say that they involve the same processes, right? So the kind of processes that we find in living things, metabolism or reproduction or growth, are actually processes that you can find perhaps in a simpler form in the non-living world as well, right? These are all different ways in which you could argue that life and non-life are in one or another way continuous. And I want to go through a few of these to give you an idea how people were thinking about this. So one of them, of course, is material continuity, that I've talked about the most so far. So abiogenesis requires only ordinary chemical matter. That is the same matter that makes up the non-living universe. You know, it just consists in a reconfiguration of existing non-living matter into increasingly lifelike arrangements. And it's quite a few people who sort of at the beginning of the 20th century go for this kind of stuff, including Trolland and Lippmann. Then there's something that we might call naturalistic and methodological continuity. So naturalistic continuity basically says there's no supernatural causes or principles or mechanisms that are involved in bringing about life. It's nothing other than your run-of-the-mill physics and chemistry. It's closely connected to methodological continuity, which says that the methods of chemistry, biology, and physics are the right methods to settle the question, right? So this is the idea that whatever we were doing in chemistry and physics and in biology at the beginning of the 20th century, that's the kind of stuff we need to keep on doing if we want to understand how life works, even if at that point, all we could do is sort of speculate. And here's sort of Oporin, the last sentence of his famous 1924 article, which, by the way, only appeared in Russian. So this one only became widely available in the 1960s. Oporin really became famous with the 1938 translation of his 1936 book. That really sort of put his name out there in the English-speaking world. What we do not know today, we shall know tomorrow. A whole army of biologists is studying the structure and organization of living matter, while a no less number of physicists and chemists are daily revealing to us new properties of dead things. Like two parties of workers boring from the opposite ends of a tunnel, they are working towards the same goal. The work has already gone a long way, and very, very soon the last barriers between the living and the dead will crumble under the attack of patient work and powerful scientific thought. People were optimistic. Again, all without experiments, right? Or mostly. So nomenological continuity is another thing that we found in the literature. So this is the idea that the same laws of nature or principles or even just regularities apply to life as they do to non-life. And we can see it, for instance, in Schaefer. The phenomena of life are investigated and can only be investigated by the same methods as all other phenomena of matter. So this is still methodological continuity. And the general results of such investigations tend to show that living beings are governed by laws identical with those which govern inanimate matter, right? So we're studying the same types of laws. Leaves, of course, open the question whether there's any new laws that came to apply to, you know, going from non-life to life, some kind of proto-life. Was it evolutionary from the start? Did it become evolutionary at a later stage? Someone like Henry Osborn, thought about these things, an American paleontologist. Finally, processual continuity. So this is the idea that the same processes can be found in the living world as can be found in the lifeless world. Typically, they talk about higher level properties like metabolism and reproduction. So for instance, Oporin argues that in metabolism in organisms, you know, that's very, very similar to the decomposition of hydrogen peroxide by platinum, right? The actual mechanism of the process is similar. A physicist, John Butler Burke, at the end of his sort of 1906 Origin of Life, describes the aim of his book as follows: to indicate, and it is hoped also to prove, as far as proof is possible, the continuity of vital processes, that the links between the organic and the inorganic, between living and dead matter, form an unbroken and continuous chain which connects biology with physics as closely as it unites the two with chemistry. Okay, so now you have an idea of sort of this notion of continuity. It plays a role in this kind of early work on the origins of life. Why, right? Why would you talk about continuity this much and this explicitly? Also because in the current origin of life literature, people don't talk about it that much, if at all, right? Sort of this notion really becomes less and less popular or sort of widely discussed as time goes by. And what we wanted to do is, part of what we want to do is sort of explain why that is the case. Why was it a popular notion at the beginning of the 20th century? And we think that one of the reasons is vitalism. Vitalism was a particular way of looking at life, very varied history, but in general, you can describe it, vitalism, should be restricted to theories in which the difference between life and non-life, living matter and non-living matter, living bodies and dead bodies, bodies and machines, biology and physics, is crucial. However, this difference is spelled out. This is a very sort of abstract definition. It's the most abstract one I could find by Charles Wolfe, who studies the history and philosophy of vitalism. But the bottom one, I think, is a little bit more concrete, has an epistemological component as well. Vitalism is believed that forces, properties, powers, or principles which are neither physical nor chemical are at work in or are possessed by living organisms, and that any explanation of the distinctive features of living organisms which did not make reference to such properties, forces, powers, or principles would be incomplete. Right? So besides chemistry and physics, there's something extra, a sort of secret ingredient X, which makes life into actual life. You can't just get at it through sort of your standard scientific research into physics, chemistry, biology, etc. Now, the beginning of the 20th century saw somewhat of a neo-vitalist revival. So vitalism, like I said somewhat earlier, was popular during the 17th century, well, late 17th, 18th century, 19th century, but throughout the 19th century, it starts to become less popular because people start to discover all of these things about cells that previously they didn't really have that much access to. And somehow this sort of optimism makes vitalism a little bit less interesting or current. And that changes again at the beginning of the 20th century because there's still a group of people who sort of feel that this mechanistic view of life is not just incomplete, right, because it wasn't complete, that was a fact, but also that it cannot be complete, right, so that you need this secret ingredient X next to physics and chemistry in order to be able to explain how life came about, what it is. I call this a pessimistic conjecture, and it is sort of the first pessimistic conjecture. Because, mind you, people who were vitalists couldn't prove this, right? You would sort of, if you want to prove that, you have to do all of the chemical and physical experiments that you can do, and then you say, and we still can't explain life, right? But you can't do all of those experiments, so you sort of have to go by other reasons. Two sort of quite well-known exponents of this way of thinking were Hans Driesch, who sort of introduced this notion of the entelechy as a sort of non-physical life force that can explain life's complexity and self-directedness. Another person who sort of often connected to this neo-vitalist revival is Henri Bergson, who came up with this notion of the élan vital as the motive force behind organic evolution. Should note that Hans Driesch was an embryologist, so a scientist who sort of couldn't reconcile a mechanistic view of life with what he saw in his embryological experiments. In the case of Henri Bergson, he was a French philosopher who had this notion of élan vital as part of a much broader way of looking at reality, including life. So neo-vitalism was still abandoned. Why? By 1932, here we have sort of a bit by again G.B.S. Haldane, who came up with, who was one of the originators of this Operin-Haldane hypothesis. Biologists have almost unanimously abandoned vitalism as an acknowledged belief. Right? And the common explanation for this is a negative explanation. So in the sense that it sort of says that what makes vitalism less popular is the fact that vitalism had issues. Vitalism was vague and inexact. What is this entelechy exactly? What is this élan vital, this sort of secret ingredient X, however you want to explain that, that sort of gives us life. Non-physical stories were sort of considered meaningless. This fits within a sort of general way of thinking about science at the start of the 20th century, this sort of logical empiricist view of things. And no vital laws had been found, right? So no one had found sort of next to this physical principle and this chemical principle, here we have this vital principle. And if you take that into account as well, you can explain all of these things about living systems, right? These simply weren't found. Something is wrong with vitalism. The negative view strikes me as a little bit too principled and metaphysical. I want to suggest that what was actually going on in just wider discussions about vitalism is not just that vitalism had issues, but also that the physical chemical approach was just very, very successful, right? So I would go from a negative view of vitalism to a positive view of physicochemical scientific practice, where there were just many routes of attack for understanding all kinds of vital phenomena, right? Not just, not necessarily the origin of life at that point, but certainly cell division, or how can an entire embryo come from a single starting cell, or how do the spermatozoa and the oocyte fuse at the start, right? All of these types of questions could be attacked increasingly successfully, right? So through this sort of physicochemical scientific approach. Now that they were successful is a fact. You might sort of push me and say, yeah, but okay, what's success, right? Are you like a full-on realist? I'm not. I would sort of cash that out in pragmatic terms, but I'm a progressivist. I consider it a fact that sort of the scientific research that's been going on over the past 2 years has led to a tremendous increase in our scientific knowledge. Without committing to some specific sort of version of a theory of scientific knowledge here. At any rate, it was successful, and so we might as well stick to that same route, right? So this is the optimistic conjecture to counter the pessimistic one. And in the origins field, sort of the success of this physical-chemical approach led to, the second one, okay, so we might as well stick to the same route, and then eventually that led to sort of a much more successful approach from the 1950s onwards, which became experimental. That's sort of the dynamics over the course of the 20th century. And this principle, I think this sort of rests on this principle of continuity, right? So this idea that because life and non-life are continuous, and because these methods that we have for studying non-life are so good, we might as well also apply these to studying life, right? And continue on that path, and then eventually we should gain a better understanding of how life has come about. And people use this principle of continuity in one of its many forms, right? So I gave you about 4, but these people are never they're scientists for the most part, they're never very clear about what they mean with the principle of continuity precisely. But they mean either something material or processual or a combination of these, or indeed something else. They use it explicitly against vitalism in this way. In some cases, so Schaefer, Trollen, Doppler, and Haldane do this. Some use it more implicitly. Some don't mention it at all, right? This especially starts to happen with the literature from the 1940s onwards. Why does this start happening? Well, people sort of are done with vitalism or worrying about how should we go about studying this topic. They just start doing it, basically. So here's Schaefer, for instance. Inorganic crystals grow and multiply and reproduce their like, given a supply of the requisite pabulum, so the right food stuff, right? So what we see in crystals is growth and multiplication and reproduction on a sort of food stuff. This is also what we see in life. There's sort of parallels or something that goes beyond parallels between these types of processes. Vitalism and a working hypothesis has not only had its foundations undermined, but most of the superstructure has toppled over. And if any difficulties of explanation still persist, we are justified in assuming that the cause is to be found in our imperfect knowledge of the constitution and working of living material, right? So if we just keep cracking at it through this sort of physical science approach, we'll get there. Trolland, it is the purpose of the present paper to combat the thesis of the new vitalism by showing how a single physical-chemical conception may be employed in a rational explanation of the very life phenomena which the neo-vitalists regard as inexplicable on any but metaphysical grounds. Right? It would seem then, from the above review of the objections which the neo-vitalists rages against our acceptance of the physical-chemical theory of life, that these objections may be reduced to the problem of discovering a physical or chemical conception capable of accounting for the observed facts of organic regulation. So that was sort of the function of do I have something more here? No. That was sort of the function of continuity thinking, I think, in the early 20th century. So it was basically to argue against a vitalistic conception and sort of give a kind of structure to your thinking about the origin of life. We can actually attack this physico-chemically. This starts to go away in the 1950s. That is to say, this sort of use of continuity against vitalism, because vitalism is no longer seen as a viable way of looking at life. But the notion of continuity doesn't go away entirely. It gets sort of repurposed and used against a different view of life that pops up that we call miraculism. So like I said, generally by the 1950s, no more worrying about vitalism. It's sometimes mentioned, but if it is, very, very briefly, or implicitly, or not at all. There's some exceptions there, but I'll skip over that. And this is sort of the attitude that you have at that point. To make an organism demands the right substances in the right proportions, in the right arrangement. We do not think that anything more is needed, but that is problem enough. And this is in 1954, right? So these first experimental results looking into the origin of life came in 1953. Oh, right, I'm actually going to talk about that. So this is that experimental result. I talked about the second one, the discovery of amino acid synthesis from simple inorganic gases. This was the Miller-Urey experiment. But another very important discovery is the structure of DNA, which carries the genes, which are sort of instructions to cellular operating. And this discovery of this structure also meant that, we now know what kind of molecules we have to work towards in doing our chemistry and our physics. And we also know that we have that if we start from simple beginnings, we can create more complicated organic molecules, which then also ultimately feature in DNA and the like, right? So there was a kind of, this really was the beginning of sort of an experimental optimism about us being able to crack this problem. You also see this in 1957, where you have the first international conference on origins of life research in Moscow. Oparin was Russian and was working from Moscow, so that's where it first took place. He was a very sort of big figure in the field and discovered everything from geology to physics to chemistry, right? The real coming together of all of these different individuals working on this topic. Usually not as their main topic, right? They were working either on embryology or inorganic chemistry or this or that type of sugar or whatever, but they also had an interest in sort of this origin of life question. The professionalization of the field really starts in the 50s. Okay, vitalism is not an option. Continuity between life and non-life is assumed, but if chemical evolution could in principle lead to living systems, why has it done so only once, seemingly? Because we never see life coming about on the planet, right now, also not then. And why is it so notoriously difficult to reproduce this phenomenon? Why can't we just stick together a few chemicals and then life just sort of falls out? Some people these are two legitimate questions. These are still legitimate questions. And they engender a kind of optimism in some, sort of, we'll just keep applying the scientific method, but also a kind of pessimism in others. And some of these people are people like Jacques Monod, a very famous French molecular biologist, and Francis Crick, one of the co-discoverers of the structure of DNA. And they start to view sort of the origin of life as such an improbable event that it's like a miracle or a happy accident. Life is a sort of statistical anomaly, and that prevents us from properly explaining its origin, right? So there's also an epistemic consequence to this improbability of life coming about. Life is contingent upon such a large number of processes that need to be coordinated so specifically that any attempt at replication or understanding is moot. So this is what I would call pessimistic conjecture 2. It's somewhat similar to vitalism. You no longer say, we need a secret ingredient X, and that's what we need to find. No, which is extra physical, extra chemical. No, we even if the story is completely physical and chemical, it is such a complicated story where such specific processes need to happen in such a specific order that we can't do that. We'll never crack that problem. There's a kind of epistemological gap which we cannot really cross. Here is Jacques Monod, for instance, in his book Chance and Necessity. The first specific sequence of amino acids that arose on Earth was a result of a purely random process with no regularity, special features, or restrictive characteristics. The chance of life coming about is virtually zero. He does some calculations. It has just been a huge lottery in which our number came up in the Monte Carlo game. Therefore, scientifically, there's nothing much we can do, right? Science can neither say nor do anything about a unique occurrence. You know, if life just happened once by chance. It can only consider events which form a class, whose a priori probability, however faint, is definite. Really what he's saying is, for unique events, historical events, science can't help you there. Here's Francis Crick, who, although he was a convinced mechanist and anti-vitalist, says the following in his 1988 book, Life Itself. An honest man, armed with all the knowledge available to us now, could only state that in some sense, the origin of life appears at the moment to be almost a miracle. So many are the conditions which would have had to have been satisfied to get it going. You know, and even sort of, I mean, he also notes some sort of empirical reasons for thinking that. The Miller-Urey experiment was done with a particular understanding of the atmosphere at that time as being very, very reducing. By the 1980s, this idea of the early Earth atmosphere as being reducing wasn't very current anymore, which for him is an additional reason to think that, well, it's just a sort of happy accident, because without a reducing environment, it becomes a lot less easy, it becomes a lot more difficult to get from these simple organic molecules to something bigger, like a bigger molecule. You just have to believe me in this case. For Crick, the core philosophical issue was that life's origins were an extraordinary contingent event, not amenable to scientific study. So I think that origins of life researchers really had a challenge, right? They had to argue that there is this epistemological gap, but that this epistemological gap that was identified by miraculists was bridgeable through science. And they did this by positing that in the right circumstances, life wasn't improbable or unique, it was quite a probable outcome. Early examples of this are Bernal and Needham, already in the 50s. The track from the inorganic world by steps, the track from the inorganic worlds by steps, which, though they cannot be indicated in detail for the lack of necessary research, most of which is quite feasible, nevertheless are not only plausible, but with our present knowledge inevitable. Similarly, Needham, fundamental axiom, the plausible assumption that the origin of life was a spontaneous natural sequence of most probable events. We have to accept this fundamental axiom in origins of life research if we want to do any kind of research in that area, is basically what they're saying. Someone who sort of uses this principle a little bit more directly is Leslie Orgel, an origins of life researcher who worked on prebiotic chemistry mostly, and he proposes sort of a methodological principle of continuity which requires that each stage in evolution develops continuously from the previous one. There needs to be a plausible stepwise transition from one similar state to the next. So no breaks in the sequence, no radically different kind of organization between non-life and life, no sudden large leaps, like contra Monod, because Monod basically thinks, oh, these molecules need to come together at some point and then life just falls out, maybe in one step. He seems to see, well, maybe not life entirely, but for instance, a protein, which is a very complicated big molecule. If you make that from these simple organic molecules, that, you know, the chances of that sort of happening and then these different parts, these different amino acids being sequenced in the right way throughout that protein for it to then be functional and sort of lead to yet different things in life are so small, even at that scale, that just can't happen for Monod. And then Orgel says, no, that's already assuming too large a leap. You need to go smaller. And if we assume these things, no breaks, same organization, small steps, then we can actually reason backwards, right? And this goes against Crick. We can actually look at life nowadays and sort of reason backwards what molecularly must have happened to get up to this point. Morowitz, similarly, for any stage in biogenesis, a continuous series of plausible transitions must lead backward in time to the non-living geochemistry of the planet, and forward in time to biologically conventional cellular life. This puts the burden of proof on any theory that requires discontinuities, right? So if you are a miraculist or a vitalist, and you somehow think life and non-life are discontinuous, you should prove that that's the case, because most of what we find points in the other direction. And this sort of has two functions, right? So our current knowledge can be used to make retrodictive inferences. That's what you see over there with the reasoning backwards, right? Forward in time to biochemical conventional life, but backwards in time to geochemistry of the planet. And theories based on discontinuities or highly improbable events can be rejected. This is vitalism, miraculism, but also divine intervention, right? A necessary condition for a scientific approach to the origin of life is that the event be largely deterministic within the scope of ordinary physics and chemistry. Okay, so to sort of bring this story together a little bit, we think the principle of continuity has played a legitimizing role in the origins of life research. Right? It helped turn the problem of the origin of life from an inscrutable mystery into a scientifically robust field of research. It did so first, encountering vitalism. It allowed scientific investigation to proceed despite the complexity of life, making a fully mechanistic account seem hopeless, right? This is pessimistic conjecture one that sort of motivated the vitalists. And second, in countering miraculism, it provided the essential scaffolding that allowed scientific investigation to proceed despite the inherent difficulties posed by studying singular events in the deep past, right? So this is pessimistic conjecture two, the one that motivated sort of Crick's and Monod's thinking that really we can't get at the bottom of this. By insisting on continuity and also specifying how that was supposed to take place, people tried to counter this pessimistic style of thinking. So continuity today, this was the 20th century that I spoke about for the most part. What's it like in the 21st century? It is rarely discussed anymore, certainly not as a percentage of the origins of life literature. So this field, has a lot more publications now than it did in the 50s or in the... I think, in a year, maybe we have 10 times as many publications dealing with the origin of life in one way or another being published than were published throughout the entire first half of the 20th century. Nevertheless, we do believe that continuity still has two heuristic roles in contemporary science. So it is a plausibility criterion for hypotheses, semi-methodological criterion for hypotheses. Largely, I think, in the background, this idea of no leaps, no discontinuities, no highly improbable events. And also, I think it does aid a little bit in sort of new hypothesis formation. So you get these you get people trying to bring together origins of life with, for instance, the origins of evolution. Here's a STEM life model by Fournier from 2024. In which he tries to, it embeds abiogenesis within a broader continuity of diversification and extinction of both hereditary lineages and chemical systems. So what it's basically saying is what we see in evolution on the level of sort of whole organisms in extant biology, that those kinds of evolutionary processes also play a large part in these very early chemical systems. Right? There is a continuity, not just in any process, but also in that evolutionary process, right? There is this sort of way in which thinking about the continuity between all aspects of non-life and life still guides the way that people hypothesize, theorize, and do experiments in this field even today. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.